New York thought he was crazy. Doctors diagnosed him as broken. The FBI laughed at him. But every night, the man wandering the streets in pajamas was quietly ruling a billion-dollar criminal empire. This is the true story of the Mafia boss who hid his power behind madness. They called it the takedown of the century. On a cold November morning in 1986, the doors of the federal courthouse in Manhattan burst open, and prosecutors flooded out like victorious soldiers returning from war. Cameramen crowded around them, their flashes exploding like gunfire. Reporters shouted questions, trying to capture the moment history shifted. For the first time ever, the American government had done the unthinkable. They had crippled the Mafia at its head. 5 bosses. 5 kings of New York. All convicted in one sweeping blow. The headlines wrote themselves. The commission crumbles. Mafia empire shattered. As a New York victory. Inside the courthouse, U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani stood beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by his team. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, not from fear, but from the burning exhilaration of a man who had just rewritten the rules of war. With the power of the RICO Act behind him, he had pulled off something generations of prosecutors had failed to achieve. Paul Castellano of the Gambinos. Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese. Carmine Persico of the Colombos. Tony Dux Corallo of the Lucchese. And the boss of bosses in their shadowy council, the commission itself. Locked away. 100 years each. The mobs that had dominated New York like an invisible government finally felt mortal. For decades, these men had been untouchable. Too insulated, too clever, too distant from the violence they ordered. But now, with the verdict delivered and the prison doors clanging shut, the courtroom felt like the end of an era. Agents clapped each other on the back. Prosecutors grinned like victorious prize-fighters. Even the normally stoic FBI observers cracked rare, relieved smiles. This was more than a courtroom win. It was a message. The Mafia was not invincible. Outside, rain washed over the courthouse steps, but nothing could dampen the victory. Photographers snapped the dripping umbrellas, the tight-lipped smiles of prosecutors, the jubilant nods from federal brass. America watched. Politicians applauded. Newspapers rushed to print. The FBI had every reason to celebrate. Or so they thought. But in the middle of that triumph, something felt wrong. The unease began quietly, almost as a whisper beneath the roar of celebration. It drifted through the ranks of the FBI's organized crime units. Not panic, not fear, but a subtle, nagging question. A name. A face. A puzzle piece that didn't fit. Agent John Pritchard, the man responsible for investigating the Genovese crime family, stood near the courthouse entrance, letting the rain cool the adrenaline boiling in his blood. Everyone around him seemed ready to raise a glass, but he couldn't shake the feeling that a ghost was sitting in the middle of their triumph. That ghost was Vincent, the chin Gigante. The oddball. The mumbling old man. The pajama-wearing specter wandering Greenwich Village. To the public, he was just a neighborhood eccentric, a harmless relic muttering to parking meters and stumbling around in a bathrobe. To the tabloids, he was a joke, the odd father. A man who looked too broken to cross the street, let alone run a criminal empire. To the FBI, he was a footnote, a lunatic, a distraction. Or so they convinced themselves. But as Pritchard watched his colleagues celebrate, a knot twisted in his gut. Something wasn't adding up. The Genovese family was known as the most structured, wealthiest, and disciplined mafia family in the country. They didn't make mistakes. They didn't leave their leadership exposed. Yet here they were, congratulating themselves for taking down Fat Tony Salerno, a man who, yes, held power, but never quite fit the profile of a true puppet master. Salerno was calm. Salerno was predictable. Salerno didn't strike fear into the underworld the way a kingpin should. Pritchard had been assigned to the Genovese squad long enough to feel the imbalance in his bones. He had watched their movements, studied their routines, followed the patterns woven into decades of criminal history. And despite what the FBI believed, Salerno's shadow didn't stretch long enough to cover the entire empire. Not even close. But Vincent Gigante, he was different. Quiet. Strange. Invisible when he wanted to be. unreachable when the FBI pressed too hard. He was there, always there, hovering around the edges of the Genovese family like a ghost no one feared because no one believed he mattered. But Pritchard had seen things. Offset behaviors, odd rituals, strange patterns in surveillance logs. Moments where the harmless madman stood a little too close to the real players of the underworld. Moments where power flickered behind those drooping eyes. Moments where the lunatic mask seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. Now, with the 5 bosses locked away, the Genovese family should have crumbled. They should have staggered, panicked, fallen into chaos like any beheaded empire. But they didn't. They stayed steady. Too steady. Almost as if someone else, someone smarter, quieter, more calculating, was holding the reins. Someone the FBI refused to believe was capable of ruling anything. Someone who shuffled through the streets in frayed slippers and muttered at fire hydrants. Someone who could have fooled them all. The triumph began to sour. Back inside the courthouse, the victory press conference was wrapping up. Giuliani shook hands. Cameras flashed. A reporter asked him, "Is the Mafia finished?" He answered confidently, "We've taken out their leadership. This is a crippling blow." Pritchard watched from the back of the crowd, rainwater dripping from his hair. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. Because deep down, he knew something that no one else seemed willing to admit. The Mafia wasn't finished. It was evolving. And the most dangerous boss of all was still out there. A phantom wearing a bathrobe. A mastermind hidden behind madness. A king disguised as a beggar. Vincent the Chin Gigante. The man the FBI laughed at might just be the biggest mistake they had ever made. And this so-called victory? It might not be the end. It might be the beginning of the real war. Welcome my beautiful family and friends to my YouTube channel. Please click on subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. Thank you especially for sticking around to this very moment. Now back to the story. Before the FBI ever feared him, before the tabloids ever named him, before prosecutors dared whisper his name in court, Vincent the Chin Gigante walked the streets of Greenwich Village like a phantom no one could understand. If you lived in downtown Manhattan in the late 70s and early 80s, you might have seen him, just once, shuffling out of an old brick apartment on Sullivan Street. His hair uncombed, his bathrobe stained and sagging off his shoulders. Pajamas peeking out beneath it, slippers scuffing against the concrete. Sometimes he walked with his head tilted to the side, mumbling nonsense to a fire hydrant. Other times he stood frozen on a street corner, staring blankly at a lamppost, as if it were whispering secrets only he could hear. There were days he clutched a paper bag like a lifeline. Days he wandered in circles, muttering at parked cars. Days he collapsed on a stoop, trembling like a man lost in his own mind. To the locals, he was an oddity, a neighborhood ghost. Harmless. To the neighborhood kids, he was a story their parents told them to keep them close at night. Stay away from the Chin, they said. He's not right in the head. To the tabloids, he was a punchline. The odd father, the crazy boss who talks to parking meters. They printed photos of him in oversized slippers and a frayed bathrobe, looking more like a homeless wanderer than a criminal empire's mastermind. And the FBI, those trained observers, those proud hunters of American organized crime, believed it all. This was no boss, they thought. No strategist. No force of power. Just a broken man drifting through the streets like a half-forgotten memory. After all, how could someone run the Genovese family, the richest, most secretive, most feared mafia family in the country, when he couldn't even cross the street without help? Yet every time Gigante stumbled across the intersection, whispering to himself, 2 things remained consistent. He was never alone. And he was never touched. Whether the FBI noticed it or not, there was always someone watching him from the shadows, lurking at a doorway, leaning against a lamppost, or sitting quietly in a parked car. A bodyguard? A handler? A soldier? No one knew. The more he behaved like a lunatic, the more invisible he became. And that made Vincent the most dangerous kind of threat. The FBI profile told a simple story. Vincent Gigante, late 50s. Italian-American. Former boxer. Possible mental illness. Low-level mob affiliation. Harmless. At least, that's what they wrote, again and again in their reports. Because what else could they conclude when agents saw him muttering to water fountains and wandering around with hospital bracelets still attached to his wrist? He checked into psychiatric wards every few months, complaining of hearing voices or losing time. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, dementia, depression, paranoia. They wrote it all down in thick medical files that the FBI accepted as proof. He took medication, at least the hospital believed he did. He sat through evaluations. He answered questions with vacant eyes and trembling hands. It looked real. It looked convincing. It looked tragic. And that was the beauty of it. His madness wasn't sloppy. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't wild or unpredictable. It was controlled, measured, precise, almost orchestrated. But no one was looking closely enough to see the pattern. Not yet. The FBI saw what they wanted to see. A man too broken to be dangerous. A man too frail to hold influence. A man too confused to mastermind anything. Agents laughed about him in the office hallways. They traded stories about him urinating in public or holding an umbrella fully open while showering, a legendary tale told with amusement rather than suspicion. They wrote reports describing him as incoherent and non-functional, a man unable to participate in daily life. No one asked the most important question. If he was truly insane, why was he still alive? In the world of the Mafia, madness wasn't tolerated. It wasn't protected. It wasn't allowed. You didn't get to be mentally unstable in a family known for order, discipline, and cold efficiency. A weak link would have been eliminated decades ago. Yet Gigante was still there. Still drifting through the neighborhood. Still appearing near the Genovese power players. Still treated with an odd, almost reverent distance. Something didn't match. Something didn't align. Something about the performance was too perfect. A ghost, but also a shadow. A lunatic, but also a presence. One particular morning made everything feel even stranger. 2 FBI agents sat in a parked car near Sullivan Street, sipping cheap coffee while they half-heartedly watched the building where Gigante lived with his mother. Right on schedule, the chin emerged, bathrobe dragging, slippers loose, hair wild. He moved slowly, as though gravity resisted him more than it did any other human on Earth. He shuffled toward the crosswalk, muttering to himself, eyes unfocused. The agents smirked. "Poor guy," one of them said. No wonder he never made it in organized crime. But then something happened that neither agent forgot. A black sedan rolled up behind Gigante. 2 sharp-dressed men stepped out. They didn't touch him, didn't speak to him, didn't guide him. They simply watched him. Their eyes stayed on his back until he reached the corner. Then, as naturally as breathing, they followed him from a distance. The agents shared a puzzled glance. That's weird. Yeah, real weird. But the moment passed. They shrugged it off. It didn't fit the narrative they already believed. A crazy man with a pair of shadows? Just another New York City mystery. And so the question slowly formed in the darkness. If he was just a confused old man, why did powerful mobsters trail behind him like silent guardians? If he was harmless, why did no one dare approach him? If he was mentally unfit, why did his presence seem to make seasoned killers go quiet? Why did the neighborhood treat him with a mix of amusement and fear? Why did every mob meeting change when he was nearby? Why did his madness feel less like chaos and more like camouflage? A ghost can only be ignored for so long. As the FBI celebrated the fall of the Mafia's commission, a shadow moved in the opposite direction, quiet, unassuming, and far more dangerous than anyone realized. Vincent Gigante had built a fortress around himself, not with guns or soldiers, but with confusion, misdirection, and a performance so convincing it blinded the very men hunting him. And in the coming months, that performance would crack open the biggest embarrassment in FBI history. Because the question that no one had dared to ask would soon demand an answer. How does a madman walk among killers? How does a lunatic command obedience? How can a ghost in a bathrobe rule an empire? The mystery had begun. And the truth would be darker than anyone guessed. Long before he was a ghost in a bathrobe, long before doctors scribbled diagnoses and the FBI dismissed him as a wandering lunatic, Vincent the Chin, Gigante was a rising force inside the underworld. A young man with fists like hammers and a mind sharper than the blade tucked beneath his jacket. His story begins not in madness, but in violence. In 1957, Gigante was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, and deadly serious. A former boxer with a decent record and a reputation for doing what others were scared to attempt. That spring, he was given an assignment that could have made his career: assassinate Frank Costello, the powerful head of the Luciano crime family. It was a contract soaked in ambition, a hit that would elevate those behind it. And Gigante, newly trusted, pulled the trigger in a Manhattan lobby as Costello stepped out of an elevator. The bullet grazed Costello's head, knocking him down but failing to kill him. Costello survived. The hit missed. And Vincent Gigante, instead of being punished, vanished. Not literally but socially.
Publicly. Tactically.
Most hitmen who failed a job like that disappeared permanently, their bodies found floating somewhere in Brooklyn. But Gigante was different. Someone wanted to keep him alive. Someone believed in his potential. The failed hit didn't end his career. It started it. Within a few years, he emerged again, not as a gunman, but as a rising strategist inside the newly reorganized Genovese family. By the early 1960s, Gigante held the title of capo, commanding his own crew. He was feared where it mattered, respected where it counted, and quiet everywhere else. He understood something most mobsters didn't. Visibility is death. While other bosses strutted through nightclubs and restaurants, ruling through spectacle, Gigante did something unheard of. He disappeared on purpose. He avoided public photos. He avoided attention. He avoided style, flash, and ego. He operated like someone who already knew the FBI's future. That surveillance would tighten, the government would get smarter, and the Mafia's world would shrink. So, he shrank faster. By the mid-60s, he wasn't just a rising star. He was a problem for law enforcement. Too quiet. Too disciplined. Too hard to track. And then something strange happened. Gigante began showing signs of mental instability, sudden outbursts, erratic behavior, rambling speech, confusion. At first, it looked like stress. Then trauma. Then something darker. By the late 60s, it became impossible to tell whether Vincent Gigante was a potential boss or a man falling apart. That is, until 1970, the year he invented the lie that would fool the world. The trouble came from a small, almost comical charge: allegations that Gigante had bribed nearly an entire police force in a New Jersey town where he kept a home. The case was strong. The prosecutors were determined. Gigante was cornered. And this is where his true genius emerged. Instead of fighting the charges with lawyers and alibis, he walked himself into a psychiatric hospital and told the doctors he was losing control of his mind. He mumbled. He twitched. He stared at the floor. His answers drifted into nonsense. He played the role perfectly, with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, severe depression, and paranoid delusions. They labeled him mentally unfit for trial and sent that assessment straight to the courtroom. Gigante walked free. Not acquitted, but dismissed. And the performance stuck. His attorney claimed he couldn't understand the charges. Medical records showed he was unable to function. The court believed it. The Mafia world whispered, "This guy may be smarter than all of us." And from that moment on, Vincent Gigante weaponized madness. Over the next 2 decades, Gigante perfected the routine. Every few months, he'd check himself into a psychiatric ward for what the FBI later called tune-ups. It became as regular as a dentist appointment. He'd arrive mumbling, shuffling, barely aware of his surroundings. He'd leave quieter, calmer, and more convincing than ever. Doctors recorded hallucinations, memory loss, delusions, cognitive decline. His medical file grew thicker than a phone book. He kept every note, every diagnosis, every prescription. They became his armor,
his camouflage,
his shield. Because with each new hospital stay, his insanity became more believable, more documented, more unassailable. When FBI agents knocked on his door, he wandered out in pajamas, drooling, barely able to form a sentence. When prosecutors called him to testify, his lawyers produced medical evaluations showing he couldn't distinguish reality from dreams. When surveillance teams followed him, he walked in circles, spoke to parking meters, clutched a bathrobe like it was a lifeline. It was absurd. It was tragic. It was genius. Every ridiculous act, every public humiliation, protected him. Danger hiding beneath absurdity. By the early 1980s, the lie had become so widespread that even veteran agents felt pity for him. Some genuinely believed he had lost his mind. A man who once stared down the barrel of a gun now stared at the cracks in the sidewalk like they were constellations. A man who once commanded enforcers now muttered nonsense to strangers. A man who once shot at Frank Costello now shuffled around in slippers. The FBI laughed. The tabloids mocked. The city shook its head in pity. No one saw the danger. No one noticed that whenever he wandered the streets like a dazed ghost, powerful mobsters followed close behind. Not guiding him, not touching him, guarding him,
protecting him,
serving him. Because behind the mumbling, behind the pajamas, behind the trembling hands, the most feared mafia boss of the late 20th century was hiding. A man who commanded millions. A man who controlled labor unions, construction empires, political access. A man who ruled from the shadows with cold calculation. His madness was a stage costume. His insanity, the greatest performance in criminal history. And for over 20 years, the world believed every second of it. Agent John Pritchard wasn't supposed to be thinking about Vincent Gigante. The commission trial had ended. The bosses were in shackles. The FBI was celebrating one of the greatest victories in the history of American law enforcement. Every news broadcast, every headline, every politician declared it. The Mafia had been crushed. But something kept gnawing at Pritchard. Something no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. The Genovese crime family, supposedly decapitated with the conviction of Fat Tony Salerno, wasn't acting like a leaderless empire. There were no power struggles. No faction wars. No scramble for the throne. They were calm.
organized, disciplined.
As if someone unseen was still running the show. And Pritchard had a name echoing in the back of his mind. Vincent the Chin Gigante. The ghost. The muttering, pajama-clad phantom. The man the FBI openly mocked. It didn't make sense except it did. The pieces were there, scattered like broken glass. Someone just needed to pick them up. And Pritchard was beginning to realize he might be the only one willing to do it. The turning point had been years earlier, buried deep in the files of past investigations, something agents retold as a joke, a funny anecdote to lighten the grim work of chasing killers. But to Pritchard, it wasn't funny at all. The story went like this. Agents once served Gigante with a subpoena at his mother's apartment. They knocked, got no response, and entered with caution. The place was quiet until they heard running water. They approached the bathroom, opened the door, and froze. Standing beneath the shower spray, completely naked, was Vincent Gigante, holding an open umbrella over his head. Agents burst out laughing when they retold it. Pritchard didn't laugh. He found it chilling, because something about the moment was too perfect, too theatrical, too absurd, too conveniently insane. It felt like a performance,
A test.
a warning. For years, the Genovese squad, Pritchard's squad, ran surveillance on the Triangle Social Club, the unofficial nerve center of the Genovese family. They recorded license plates. They photographed every man entering and leaving. They studied patterns, movements, leadership. They caught glimpses of Gigante often, a slouching figure in a bathrobe, muttering to himself as he drifted through the streets like a wandering spirit. Surveillance logs repeatedly listed him as non-coherent, mentally unstable, irrelevant to leadership. No one saw him give orders. No one saw him discuss business. No one saw him act like a boss. And that was exactly the problem. Gigante wasn't trying to hide. He was trying to hide in plain sight. Everything about him was too convenient, too exaggerated, like he knew the cameras were there. Like he knew federal agents watched his every move. And he wanted them to see one thing only: a man they should ignore. But Pritchard wasn't ignoring him anymore. The more Pritchard reviewed the surveillance tapes, the more his stomach tightened. Why was Gigante always near high-ranking mobsters if he was truly insane? Why did his nightly routine always follow the same pattern, same time, same route, same people? Why did powerful capos stop talking when he passed them? Why did they treat him with deference, respect, fear? And why did the Genovese family remain the strongest, wealthiest, most disciplined family after their supposed boss was locked away? Pritchard began connecting dots that no one else dared touch. What if Gigante wasn't broken but brilliant? What if his insanity was the most sophisticated shield any mobster had ever built? What if the FBI, his own team, had been played for fools? The thought kept him awake at night. It made his chest tighten and his pulse quicken. It made him feel like the entire bureau had missed something enormous, something dangerous, something alive. On a cold night in January 1986, the quiet rumble of suspicion became a roar. Two detectives, Anthony Venditti and Kathy Burke, were conducting routine surveillance on a Genovese associate named Fritzi Giovanelli. It was supposed to be a quiet follow-and-watch job. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual. But the Mafia has its own sense of timing. Venditti and Burke ended their shift and stopped at a diner. Venditti stepped inside to grab coffee. Burke waited in the car. Neither of them knew Giovanelli's crew had spotted them earlier. Neither knew death was already on its way. The mobsters approached the vehicle. Burke saw them coming, reached for her weapon. But she was too late. The gunshots echoed across the street. Burke was hit. Venditti, rushing outside, was shot dead on the pavement. Blood spread across the concrete. Burke screamed for backup. Sirens wailed into the night. Pritchard got the call minutes later. The voice on the other end was shaky. Hollow.
Broken.
Tony's gone. Pritchard's hand trembled as he gripped the phone. His chest tightened. His vision blurred with a rage he didn't know he was capable of feeling. Venditti wasn't just a colleague. He was a friend, a father, a man who trusted Pritchard, a man who believed in the work. And now he was dead. Killed by a Genovese soldier. Killed by the empire Pritchard was supposed to dismantle. Killed under the shadow of a man the FBI still refused to take seriously. The grief hit first. Then the anger. Then something harder, something sharp, cold, and unshakable. Determination. This wasn't a job anymore. It was a promise. The next morning, Pritchard walked into the office with a different look in his eyes. There was no more doubt. No more hesitation. No more fear of being wrong, or mocked, or dismissed. Gigante wasn't insane. Gigante wasn't harmless. Gigante wasn't irrelevant. He was the center of everything. He was the one they missed. The one they underestimated. The one who orchestrated murders from behind a mask of madness. Pritchard slammed a stack of surveillance reports on his desk and addressed his team. "We're going after the chin," he said, voice steady, jaw clenched. "For Tony."
Gasps.
Whispers. Disbelief. But when they saw his eyes, burning with grief, sharpened by rage, they understood. This wasn't theory anymore. This wasn't speculation. This was a war. And Pritchard was going to drag Vincent Gigante into the light, even if it meant tearing down every lie, every illusion, every layer of madness he had built over 20 years. The FBI had made a mistake. A deadly mistake. And now, Pritchard would correct it. He would follow Gigante into every shadow. He would challenge every deception. He would unravel the greatest performance in mob history. Because someone had to see the truth. And someone had to make him answer for the blood he had spilled. John Pritchard had chased shadows before, but nothing like this. After Tony Venditti's murder, the Genovese family was no longer just a mob empire. It was a personal wound. And Vincent the Chin Gigante, the muttering, bathrobe-wearing ghost, was now the prime suspect hiding behind a curtain of carefully constructed madness. If Gigante was truly the boss, Pritchard knew he wouldn't find him in the daylight or in the open. He'd find him in the dark, in the cracks, in the hidden world the FBI had never properly explored. And so the hunt deepened. It began with surveillance, real surveillance. Not the casual drive-bys. Not the distant observations. This time, the FBI committed. Every night, agents climbed onto the rooftops across Sullivan Street, crawling across tar paper and gravel like soldiers behind enemy lines. Bundled in black, they lay on their stomachs, cameras at the ready, watching windows with the intensity of a sniper. The nights were brutal. Wind slicing across the roof. Rain soaking through jackets. Fingers numb from holding binoculars. Eyes burning from staring into darkened windows for hours. But Gigante's patterns were changing, and that made him dangerous. He no longer wandered the streets at unpredictable hours. He no longer drifted aimlessly in slippers. He disappeared every night at the same time, around 9:30 p.m., and reappeared the next morning near dawn. But where was he going? Pritchard had an idea. There must be another headquarters. Another safe zone. Another life. And he would find it, even if it meant freezing on rooftops for weeks. For days, agents attempted to follow Gigante's chauffeured sedan across Manhattan. It was like chasing a phantom. His drivers were experts at losing tails, slowing suddenly, speeding suddenly, slipping through yellow lights with the confidence of men who had been doing this since Prohibition. The FBI lost him almost every night, until one cold evening when the patterns finally broke. Gigante emerged from his mother's building, bathrobe, pajamas, slippers, shuffling like a man on the edge of collapse. But the moment he stepped into the car, something changed. His posture straightened. His eyes sharpened. His face hardened. It was like watching a mask fall away. He wasn't insane. Not for a second. Pritchard's heart pounded. This was it. The crack in the act. The moment they'd been waiting for. The sedan pulled away, and the FBI tailed it again. This time they didn't lose it. The car drove deeper into the city, past bustling avenues and dim alleyways, eventually stopping outside a nondescript apartment building on Manhattan's East Side. No guards in sight. No soldiers at the door. Just an ordinary building among thousands. But the FBI knew better. Gigante stepped out, no longer the stumbling lunatic. He walked with purpose, with balance, with the presence of a man who expected obedience the moment he entered a room. Pritchard whispered into the radio, "That's him. That's the real him." Now they had the location. They just needed proof. Over the next 4 months, agents conducted a surveillance operation unlike anything they'd done before. Every night, one agent crawled out onto the narrow ledge of a nearby school building, the only vantage point with a line of sight into the apartment. He lay flat on his stomach, camera lens pointed into the window, trembling from the cold and fear of being spotted. And night after night, they watched the impossible unfold. Inside the apartment, Vincent Gigante lived a second life. Gone were the bathrobe and slippers. Gone were the mutters, the trembling hands, the vacant stares. In their place, a tailored suit, a confident stride, a razor-sharp gaze. He held meetings at the kitchen table. He counted stacks of cash with quick, precise movements. He gestured with authority. He listened to reports. He gave orders. He talked clearly. He thought clearly. He acted like a king. This wasn't a mentally ill man. This wasn't a confused drifter. This was the boss of the Genovese crime family. The true boss. The one the FBI had failed to see for decades. The agent on the rooftop captured every second on film, blurry through fog and snow, but undeniable. Every night, he returned with new rolls of film, shaking from cold and adrenaline, dropping them into Pritchard's hands like stolen treasure. Pritchard spread the photographs across his desk. Gigante in a suit. Gigante counting money. Gigante holding meetings. Gigante commanding men. Every photo was a knife stabbing through the FBI's old assumption. This man wasn't insane. He was brilliant. And his madness wasn't an illness. It was a fortress. The FBI needed verbal confirmation. Proof so strong even Gigante couldn't wriggle out from under it. They got their chance sooner than expected. Pritchard and another agent approached the Triangle Social Club one afternoon, the heart of Gigante's daytime charade. The bathrobe-wearing figure was inside, slouched over, muttering nonsense as usual. But when the agents pulled him outside into the alley and the door clicked shut, the transformation was instant. His back straightened. His eyes sharpened. His voice dropped into a cold, controlled tone. Gone was the shaking fool. Before them stood a calculating strategist. Pritchard stared into Gigante's eyes and felt chills run through him. There wasn't a trace of madness. Not even a flicker. It was the mask coming off for the briefest moment, a crack in the illusion so bold it felt like a confession. That was the moment Pritchard knew. They had him. Finally. They had the truth. Back at headquarters, Pritchard pinned the photos to the board, one after another, building the case piece by undeniable piece. His team gathered around in silence. No one laughed now. No one doubted. No one mocked the idea of the odd father. The evidence was overwhelming. The performance was exposed. The myth was shattered. Vincent the Chin, Gigante, was not insane. He was the most dangerous mob boss in America. The hidden king. The master of deception. The brain behind murders, rackets, extortions, and empire-level decisions. The FBI had finally stepped into the hidden world he ruled.
And now?
Now they had to bring him down.
For vendetta.
For justice. For every year, he hid behind a lie so convincing it humiliated an entire government. The breakthrough had come. But the war was just beginning. Every empire falls. But mafia empires don't crumble from the outside. They rot from within. And for Vincent the Chin Gigante, the slow collapse began with a whisper inside a prison cell, a man weighing loyalty against survival, a man who finally broke.
His name was Bobby Manna.
A loyal Genovese lieutenant for decades, Manna had lived by the code of Omerta, the sacred mafia silence. But after years behind bars and the creeping realization that Gigante would let soldiers die before ever lifting a finger for them, something inside him shifted. The legend of the Chin began to crack. Manna flipped. Not loudly. Not with bravado. Not the way movie gangsters caved under bright lights. No. This was quieter, colder, more methodical. He began to talk.
Names.
Rackets. Hierarchies. Histories. It poured out like poison. And his words sliced right through the heart of Gigante's illusion. Manna confirmed what Pritchard suspected, what the surveillance photos showed, what the FBI needed to finally say out loud. Gigante wasn't insane. He was in charge. For years the Bureau had hunted a ghost, a lunatic, a pajama-clad wanderer. But Manna revealed the truth behind the madness. The structure, the rules, the meetings, the quiet commands passed down through layers of trusted soldiers. He told them, everything goes through the Chin. It was the first domino. And the fall had begun. Once the first domino fell, others followed. Another Genovese associate, pressured, cornered, and desperate, gave investigators the kind of lead they never expected. Bodies. Hidden bodies. Dumped, buried, forgotten. Victims of internal mafia cleanups carried out to consolidate power or erase liabilities. The informant told agents where to dig. Warehouses. Vacant lots. Garages disguised as legitimate businesses. All owned by people directly tied to Gigante's network. And when the shovels hit bone, the FBI's suspicions grew into certainty. These weren't random murders. These were orchestrated, strategic, approved, the kind of decisions only a boss could authorize. And every grave they unearthed was another coffin nail in Gigante's long-running insanity defense. Because no schizophrenic madman could maintain a murder conspiracy this clean, this efficient, this well-hidden. Not for days. Not for months. For decades. But the betrayal that truly detonated the empire came from a man few in law enforcement had ever heard of. Peter Savino. Savino wasn't a hitman. Not an enforcer. Not a traditional mobster in the cinematic sense. He was worse. He was a businessman with mafia blood running through his veins, a quiet, intelligent operator who understood money, politics, and the delicate machinery of corruption. Savino was the man Gigante had placed in charge of one of the most lucrative schemes in New York City history. The Windows Cartel. On paper, it sounded harmless. Government contracts for replacing windows in public housing. But beneath the surface, it was a near-perfect mafia monopoly. Over a decade, the 5 New York Mafia families rigged bids, threatened competitors, extorted union labor, and skimmed profits. The operation made over $170 million. And Gigante got the largest cut of all. But now Savino was dying, cancer eating him from the inside. He was out of time, out of loyalty, and facing life behind bars if he stayed silent. So he flipped. He told prosecutors everything. The secret meetings. The coded messages. The payments. The envelopes passed in quiet rooms. The control Gigante held over every dollar. He described sitting with Gigante, the real Gigante, the sharp, calculating one, negotiating percentages, resolving disputes, approving targets. Savino wasn't guessing. He was there. He saw it. He lived it. And he was ready to testify. The government now had witnesses. They had surveillance. They had bodies. They had financial trails. But they needed one final blow, one voice the world couldn't ignore. One voice that would break the mafia's spine. They got that voice from an unexpected place. Sammy the Bull Gravano, underboss of the Gambino family. John Gotti's enforcer. A man who'd personally admitted to 19 murders. A man whose words shook courtrooms like thunder. Gravano had crossed paths with Gigante many times. Rival families, yes, but kings recognize kings. And Sammy knew 2 versions of the chin. The mumbling fool on Sullivan Street, and the cold, lucid strategist who commanded the Genovese family with iron precision. In 1996, Gravano entered the courtroom, raised his right hand, and gave prosecutors the ammunition they needed. He told the jury. He wasn't crazy. He knew exactly what he was doing. I sat with him. I talked to him. He was the boss. The room went silent. The insanity defense, Gigante's shield for 20 years, was shattered in a single sentence. Sammy the Bull had spoken. And the world listened. When Vincent Gigante was finally hauled into federal court in 1997, he tried the act one last time. He slumped in his chair. He muttered to himself. His eyes drifted aimlessly. He ignored the judge, the prosecution, the cameras. His lawyers insisted he was unfit for trial. His medical documents, years of them, claimed he couldn't understand reality. But now the prosecutors had witnesses. Mana, Savino, others, and Gravano. They had photos from Pritchard's surveillance, Gigante in suits, counting money, holding meetings. They had hospital logs proving the tune-ups were timed perfectly around legal threats. They had enough evidence to bury his charade forever. One by one, the witnesses spoke, and the courtroom transformed into a graveyard for Gigante's lies. He wasn't insane. He wasn't feeble. He wasn't broken. He was brilliant. He was manipulative. He was powerful. A mafia king hiding in plain sight. And his own men, those he once commanded with whispers, were now helping destroy him. Burned by betrayal. Exposed by surveillance. Condemned by rivals. Abandoned by his own empire. And finally, stripped of his greatest weapon, his mask. Vincent the Chin, Gigante had ruled through silence. Through shadows. Through illusion. But now his illusions were gone. Stripped away by the very men who once swore loyalty to him. The king had been betrayed. The lies had unraveled. And the courtroom was his execution chamber. The fall had begun. The courtroom was silent, too silent, when the verdict was read. Not the stunned silence of surprise. Not the explosive silence of anger. But the heavy, sinking silence of inevitability. For the first time in decades, Vincent the Chin Gigante wasn't wearing a bathrobe. No slippers. No muttering. No trembling hands. He sat in a plain suit, small and still, like a man watching the edge of a cliff grow closer with each passing second. Guilty. The word cut through the room like a blade. 8 counts. Racketeering. Conspiracy. extortion, leadership of the Genovese family. He did not flinch, not even once. For a man who had spent half his life pretending reality didn't exist, the truth finally had him in its grip. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a phantom in pajamas, no longer the shadow haunting Sullivan Street. He was a prisoner, a king dragged from his throne. The last great mafia boss had fallen. Prison is the great equalizer. The walls don't care about your legacy. The guards don't care about your reputation. The inmates don't care about your theatrics. And Gigante learned that quickly. Inside those cold, fluorescent halls of the medical wing, the Chin's world unraveled. He couldn't wander the yard in a bathrobe. He couldn't mumble incoherently to parking meters. He couldn't check into psychiatric hospitals whenever danger approached. He had nowhere left to run, and nothing left to hide behind. And so, one morning, quietly, almost casually, the mask slipped. A nurse asked him how he was feeling. He answered clearly.
His voice was steady.
Lucid. Normal. Doctors were stunned. Guards were stunned. Even inmates stopped in their tracks. For decades, the FBI had watched him drool, tremble, mutter, and wander like a mind shattered by madness. Now he was talking about baseball, laughing at jokes, discussing the weather, asking for books. The ghost finally spoke with a human voice. And the revelation spread through the system like wildfire. The Chin was sane. He always had been. The deception was over. And the humiliation for the FBI, the courts, the doctors, was complete. When news of Gigante's sudden clarity reached federal prosecutors, they didn't hesitate. They struck again. A new indictment. Fresh charges. One final nail in the coffin of his legendary deceit. Obstruction of justice. Not for murder. Not for extortion. Not for decades of directing an empire of crime. But for the lie. For the performance. For the manipulation. For the psychiatric masquerade that fooled judges, doctors, juries, law enforcement, even rival mobsters. The greatest weapon he'd ever wielded, his madness, became the very reason he was dragged back into court. His lawyer could barely defend him. His family couldn't save him. The Genovese family kept their distance. Gigante stood alone. This time, he didn't pretend to be insane. This time, he didn't mumble or stare at the floor. He stood straight. He answered questions. He faced the judge with the calm of a man who had finally accepted the truth. The act was dead. And so was the empire it once protected. He pled guilty. The odd father had fooled the world. And the world finally made him pay for it. Prison life takes its toll on everyone. Even legends. Even kings. In his final years, Gigante shrank. He ate less. Spoke less. Walked slower. Breathed harder. The man who once played madness with such theatrical devotion now felt something far quieter. Something real.
Age.
He wasn't acting anymore. The tremble in his hands was no longer a performance. The weakness in his voice wasn't for show. The mask he wore for 30 years had fused with his skin. Gigante became the very thing he pretended to be. An old man sliding into the fog of time. On December 19, 2005, Vincent the Chin, Gigante took his final breath in the prison hospital wing at the age of 77. No bathrobe. No muttering. No shadowy entourage. No soldiers waiting in the hall. Just a bed, a pulse that faded, and a life that slipped into history. The last great mafia boss was gone. In the years that followed, law enforcement, journalists, criminologists, and mob historians all asked the same question. How did he get away with it for so long? How did he convince doctors, judges, agents, and entire communities that he was a broken man? How did a man who commanded millions, who ordered murders, who orchestrated massive criminal empires, hide behind a bathrobe and slippers? Some say it was brilliance. Some say it was discipline. Some say it was pure, unbreakable commitment to the role. But those who knew Gigante, his family, his soldiers, his victims, say it was something deeper.
Power.
The kind of power that doesn't shout or threaten. The kind that whispers. The kind that hides. The kind that makes silence a weapon. Gigante didn't rule by spectacle. He ruled by absence. No cameras. No phone calls. No signatures.
No spotlight.
He taught the underworld a chilling truth. The most powerful man in the room is the one no one notices. The one everyone underestimates. The one who lets the world think he is weak. That was his legacy. A warning. A lesson. A shadow that still lingers in law enforcement training rooms and FBI lecture halls. Because in the end, Vincent Gigante proved that madness can be a mask and silence can be a throne. After hearing the story of the man who fooled doctors, judges, the FBI, and even the Mafia itself, let me ask you, if a criminal could hide behind madness and rule an empire for 30 years, what other masks do powerful people wear, and how many of them are we still falling for today? Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and share this video. Click on the screen to watch the next one.